Welcome to the School of Christian Mysticism, where we're continuing our meditation on the Interior Castle by Teresa of Avila. And we're using the translation by Mirabai Starr. And we're about to enter the fourth dwelling. And Teresa tells us that when we enter the fourth dwelling, we're moving away from the natural and moving towards the supernatural. And she makes a distinction between the spiritual consolations of meditation on the one hand, and infused spiritual sweetness on the other hand. Spiritual consolation, she say, begin in our natural state, when we make use of the mind in order to rise up towards God. But spiritual sweetness, on the other hand, begins with God and flows down into us. This is quite outside of our control. But when we receive it, then it's immediately recognizable, and it far surpasses the consolation that we can reach through natural means. She uses metaphors of water to explain these two states. She says that receiving spiritual consolation, which comes from our natural state and makes use of the mind, is like having a system of aqueducts that bring the comforting water to us. And today we might see this, rather than aqueducts, we might see it as a water supply system, which I'll illustrate. This is a illustration of a water supply system. We're all familiar with it. There's a initial supply of water, and of course the source is the same for all water, but in this case the water is taken from its source and taken through a water supply, water treatment plant. Before we get it, we can turn on the tap and get the water, but it passes through a water treatment plant, which can be seen as the mind. This is active meditation where we're actually thinking about things. And then the outflow from us also goes through the water treatment plant of the mind, which determines the purity of how we think and how we behave. And usually, or sometimes, it's effective in purifying the water, but at other times, unfortunately, we discharge sewage. So it's a step on the way. On the other hand, spiritual sweetness comes to us, it wells up within us. It's like a spring, like a natural spring within us. Like this spring, which is a healing spring from my own county of Yorkshire, which flows out of the hillside. It flows abundantly, rising up out of the moorland. And as Teresa says, the spring is abundant, and so the basin spills over and a large stream flows from it. This requires no engineering skills or the construction of conduits. The water just continuously bubbles forth. This is the natural spring within us, Christ within us, continuously springing forth. And Teresa makes a distinction between what she calls the prayer of recollection on the one hand, and the prayer of quiet on the other hand. The prayer of recollection is something that happens to us before the prayer of quiet, which I'll put on one side for the moment. The prayer of recollection is when we abstract ourselves from attachment to the things of this world and the things of our ego self, and instead focus on the Christ within, the bubbling spring within us that never dies, it's always there. And the prayer of recollection is not so much a prayer in specific time, although it can be that, but it's a state of mind, a movement, a metanoia away from attachment to this world, and instead looking towards the Christ within. A state of mind that follows us throughout the day. It's there when we're engaged in vocal prayer. It's there when we're carrying out ordinary tasks. Teresa was very attached to the book, The Practice of the Presence of God. And this is about the presence of God in everything, God within us, that guides everything that we think and do. And the prayer of recollection is a move towards that. It's helpful, I think, to look at things that that prayer is not, in order to understand it perhaps a bit better. Teresa says, don't think that the mind can grasp him, that is, Christ, by striving to imagine him dwelling within. this can be an excellent meditation practice, founded on the truth that God is inside us, but it isn't the prayer of recollection. So simply using our minds, our imagination to remember that Christ is present within us, that's not the prayer of recollection. That's the water treatment plant at work. The other thing that it's not, which is emphasized not so much by Teresa, but emphasized by other mystics, it's not a state of what we might call self-absorption. This is what Jan van Roosebrugge said about it, the 14th century Flemish mystic. Now notice that whenever a person is bare and imageless in his senses and devoid of activity in his higher powers, he enters a purely natural state of rest. All persons can find and possess this state of rest in themselves by purely natural means, apart from God's grace, provided only that they can become empty of images and all activity. Such rest is nothing other than a state of empty idleness into which a person falls, and in which he becomes forgetful of himself, of God, and of all things as regards any activity. This kind of rest is contrary to that supernatural rest in which a person possesses God. So we can use all our techniques to switch off thoughts and images and have a session of what we would call meditation, in which we become shut down in a state akin to self-hypnosis. There's no doubt this is a very peaceful state, but it's not a state of resting in God. It's a state of resting in ourselves. We're not in union with God, we're in union with ourselves. And paradoxically, there's nothing essentially wrong with this. Learning to detach from the things of the world in a specific session can be helpful. But what's dangerous about it is if we come to think that this is the end point, that when we're merely resting in ourselves, we're actually resting in God, so we've made it. That's just not right. And the other, perhaps even bigger danger is that we can be proud of our ability to do it. Think that we're in some way superior because we can get into this state of self-absorption. And that's quite contrary to the state that we should be in, which Teresa emphasizes over and over and over again, which is one of humility. Humility is the key. So having indicated what the prayer of recollection is not, then I'm going to read what Teresa says that the prayer of recollection is. And she is quite pleased with this explanation. She says, I don't think I've ever before explained this as clearly as I'm describing it now. So she's quite pleased with this description, but it's, as you'll see, very much more nuanced than any of the other things that we've heard. She begins by saying, "This is the problem with me. I assume you'll understand things better the way I put them, but maybe I'm only making sense to myself." But this is what she goes on to say about the prayer of recollection. And I'm going to read this twice, and then we'll have a time of silence before those who are present live here will share their thoughts and impressions. Let's say that the senses and the faculties, which are the inhabitants of the interior castle, have gone outside. Let's say that they've been hanging around for days and years with strangers who despise all that is beautiful about the castle. When they realize their error, they come back. But before they can enter the castle, they have to break the bad habits they've been accumulating. They are not traitors. They willingly linger in the vicinity of the castle until they can be allowed in again. When the great king who is dwelling in the center of the castle perceives their goodwill, he desires in his wondrous mercy to bring them back to him. He calls to them like a good shepherd, beckons his sheep with a whistle so soft that they barely hear it. He teaches them to recognize his voice and discourages them from wandering off and losing their way home to their true abode. The shepherd's call grows so powerful that the ties that has bound the faculties to external things and estranged them from him unravel, and they enter the castle. So this is a supernatural. This is something that comes from God, not from any effort of ourselves. And she says later, the soul becomes acutely aware of a gentle withdrawal inside herself. She also tells us that His Majesty only gives this gift to those who've already begun to detach from the things of this world. So detachment from the things of this world is something that we have to put our own effort into first. I'll read her account again. Let's say that the senses and the faculties, which are the inhabitants of the interior castle, have gone outside. Let's say they've been hanging around for days and years with strangers who despise all that is beautiful about the castle. When they realize their error, they come back. But before they can re-enter the castle, they have to break the bad habits they have been accumulating. They are not traitors. They willingly enter, they willingly linger in the vicinity of the castle until they can be allowed in again. When the great king who is dwelling in the centre of the castle perceives their goodwill, he desires in his wondrous mercy to bring them back to him. He calls to them like a good shepherd beckons his sheep with a whistle so soft they barely hear it. He teaches them to recognize his voice and discourages them from wandering off and losing their way home to their true abode. The shepherd's call grows so powerful that the ties that had bound the faculties to external things and estranged them from him unravel, and they enter the castle. So now we come to the end of our meditation. And those of us who are here live now have the opportunity to share any thoughts or impressions that may have arisen for us as we come back into using our minds to say things that might only make sense to ourselves, but that's okay.